they would be successful in doing so and that they would be able to degrade or eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons program. Now, in the past, Israel adopted a slightly different approach in which they would use computer viruses to target the terminals inside Iran's nuclear facilities, and its technology infrastructure would get impacted by that. And that was perhaps more effective than necessarily blowing up any particular installation.
Israel has warned people to evacuate cities in southern Lebanon that are north of a UN-declared buffer zone, signalling a possible widening of its offensive. People have been urged to leave Nabatea, a provincial capital, and villages and towns north of the Litani River. The warning comes as the number of people who fled Lebanon for Syria since Israel's attacks intensified has reached more than 160,000, and that announcement came from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So let's discuss this with Dr. Sajjan Gohel, who is chair of the Nato Counter-Terrorism Advisory Group and International Security Director at the Asia Pacific Foundation. Dr. Gohel, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, Henry.
Thank you. When you look at what's happening, Israel ordering civilians to leave so it can crush Hezbollah, Hezbollah still managing to fire rockets across the border, and Iran warning Israel not to go any further in any possible retaliation. What, if anything, can stop a repeat of what we've seen in Gaza?
Well, unfortunately, this was a slow burn, effectively, ever since October 7th of last year, because the other challenge that was existing in the Middle East was the confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah, and there had been constant cross-rocket firing from both sides, and it continued to spiral and escalate in almost a slow car crash, culminating in the events that we've seen over the last month. And now that Israel has gone into Lebanon with its ground offensive, this doesn't look like it's going to slow down anytime soon. I think Israel has adopted a policy of what it thinks it can do in terms of dismantling Hezbollah infrastructure. It may be able to slow them down, it may be able to deter them, but as we've seen during past Israeli operations in Lebanon, they've never been able to dismantle Hezbollah.
Yeah, and when you look at the criticism the Israeli operation in Gaza has faced since October the 7th, including from the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, one wonders how they might do things differently in Lebanon, particularly given the colossal death toll, the civilian death toll, in Gaza.
Well, indeed, and also what lessons did Israel learn from the 2006 war with Hezbollah? It's worth remembering that back in 2006, Hezbollah launched a cross-border raid where they captured 2 Israeli soldiers. Israel responded with a large-scale military operation, airstrikes, ground invasions. There was even a naval blockade. And despite all of that, Hezbollah was able to demonstrate an ability to withstand the Israeli assault. They were able to continue to launch thousands of rockets into northern Israel, which they're doing right now. And in many ways, they adopted the banner of empowerment through resistance. So paradoxically, Israeli actions, particularly a prolonged occupation in 2006, contributed to Hezbollah's rise. And it's important that, for Israel's perspective, that they don't end up giving Hezbollah more oxygen and more support within Lebanon and the Middle East, as perhaps they had done previously.
But at the same time, some commentators have said the reason why Israel's war cabinet simply can't or won't stop is it knows it has a huge opportunity here. Hezbollah weakened and Iran not quite sure what to do next. Iran on the run. How true is that?
Well, Hezbollah very much depends on Iran, and it's continued to build up its military capabilities over the years by acquiring more advanced weaponry from Iran, which includes long-range missiles, drones, as well as improved defensive infrastructure. What we've seen with Israel's strategy is they've gone through the policy of decapitation, where they carried out targeted killings of some of the most senior members of Hezbollah, its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, as well as his deputies. They then also did that very sophisticated attack by planting explosives in pages and walkie-talkies, which would have been an operation that was maybe over a year planning, in the sense that Israel had thought about that long term. And they've targeted some of Hezbollah's defensive infrastructure. So it hurts Iran when one of its key proxies is being targeted this way. Now, Iran, of course, has responded in firing many ballistic missiles towards Israel. They've had limited success, but this is a situation that is continuing to spiral. And I think anyone who keeps talking about peace or negotiations, ceasefires, in many ways, they're gaslighting us
Yeah.
because we've not achieved anything.
Indeed. I mean, you can lay that at the door of President Biden, who this evening warned Israel not to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. And if you look at the way the papers are reporting it, strike oil, not nuclear, Biden urges Israel. It's on the front page of the Times. And then the Eye says, energy price scare after Biden says Israel could attack Iran's oil. What do you make of that? The choices, as it were, that President Biden is giving Israel, as if they were going to listen to him.
Well, I think we've seen the fact that the Biden administration has been very limited in its ability to de-escalate tensions, despite U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken carrying out numerous efforts of shuttle diplomacy. It's not actually achieved anything, whether it's in Gaza or when it comes to the situation that's currently unfolding in Lebanon itself. And it seems that President Biden may have made a slight mistake when he appeared to the media and seemed to intimate that, yes, it's not a good idea to target Iran's nuclear installations, but the oil installations may be a talking point. And that, of course, as you mentioned, has had a huge impact and ramifications on oil prices itself. So it does seem like Israel hasn't necessarily finished its operations against Iran. We could see this continue to spiral and escalate, and we can only see that the U.S. isn't able to actually create an off-ramp for this crisis to end.
What if all potential off-ramps were ignored? If Israel says, you know what, we've had these nuclear facilities in our sights. We know exactly where they are. We know how to get to them. This would deal a serious blow to the Iranian regime or government, and they struck them. What do you think the consequences would be if Israel struck Iran's nuclear facilities proper?
Well, the first assumption would be that they would be successful in doing so and that they would be able to degrade or eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons program. Now, in the past, Israel adopted a slightly different approach in which they would use computer viruses to target the terminals inside Iran's nuclear facilities, and its technology infrastructure would get impacted by that. And that was perhaps more effective than necessarily blowing up any particular installation. And the problem with doing that is the safety factor that could come into play. Also, not necessarily always being successful because it's a very complicated operation. Israel, for example, targeted some particular military installations in Syria over the last few months, and even those weren't always entirely successful. With a nuclear installation, it's much more complicated. It could have knock-on effects, and it could also then continue this process of spiraling. Iran could encourage other proxies like the Houthis in Yemen to launch more strikes. It also then brings in Britain, America, France, other countries that were negotiating with Iran over its nuclear weapons program, and puts them also into the spotlight. So the whole situation is one that is, unfortunately, I keep using the word spiraling, but it is the most apt word right now. And really, it is deeply disconcerting how diplomacy has proved to be completely ineffective over the last 12 months.
And Sajjan, you've sort of answered my final question, so perhaps you'll respond briefly. Prime Minister Netanyahu sells himself to the Israeli people this way. He says, you may not like me, you may not always agree with me, but I'm Bibi. I will keep you safe. Bibi keeps you safe. When this is all over, I mean, how much safer will Israel be, do you think?
Well, Israel has always seen itself as being a country in a very hostile neighborhood. I don't think it's necessarily going to be any safer, and it works also with Israel's neighbors, is you don't make yourself secure and safer by making your neighbor insecure. And I think that is one of the problems. And Netanyahu always did, as you very correctly pointed out, he portrayed himself as Mr. Security. October 7th damaged his reputation substantially. And even though he's been launching these operations, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon, and it's got support within Israel, ultimately he will always be remembered for October 7th. And it is unlikely he could survive in the next elections that Israel potentially has.
Indeed. Thank you very much to Dr. Sajjan Gohel, who is chair of the NATO Counter-Terrorism Advisory Group and International Security Director at the Asia Pacific Foundation. And so, David, you know where these things can go. You were foreign policy advisor to Tony Blair during the invasion of Iraq. When you look at the British position now, just a few days ago, we were calling for a ceasefire, 21 days. The Israelis said no, and they took out the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. Today, our posture is, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, and that's where we are. Is this where we should be?
Well, I think it's no surprise that the British government and other Western governments are saying Israel has the right to defend itself against Hezbollah. We have said, successive British governments have said that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. And there is no obvious reason why a terrorist organization in Lebanon should be mixing itself up in the affairs of Gaza and the Palestinians. So I don't think you can expect Western governments to condemn Israel for taking on Hezbollah. That said, they will certainly hope, as I said earlier, that there will be restraint. They don't want to see this war widened. So they've got the situation where they will support action against Hezbollah. And let's not forget that 60,000 Israelis who live in the north of Israel have had to be displaced from their homes because of the continuing and continuous Hezbollah attacks on northern Israel over many months. But that doesn't mean that they will want Israel to conduct a ground war and to go further into Lebanon.
And when you look at the humanitarian side of things, yes, 60,000 or more, indeed, Israelis displaced from their homes in the north of Israel. More than 1 million Lebanese on the move, internally displaced. That's out of a population of 5. And then God knows how many people are internally displaced in Gaza. What hope for humanitarian assistance during all of this?
Yes, it's a very good question. I wish I had an answer, but I think your question points to just how serious the situation has become. You know, we are now talking of hundreds of thousands of people who are affected by this crisis, which has now been going on for a year. There have been hundreds of thousands of people on the move, as you've said. There have been thousands killed, and there are thousands affected in many other ways, whether it's economically or having to be called up and do reserve duty. We've seen enormous physical damage in Gaza. There have been all sorts of incidents on the West Bank. And now we see this destruction taking place in Lebanon. So, of course, you're right. The state of the physical destruction around this crisis is enormous, and the displacement of people. That's why, of course, Western governments, particularly the Americans, have been calling for a ceasefire. This will only stop if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, which is the way we can hope that there will then be an end to the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. But there's no sign of that at the moment.
Why do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu seems so deaf to appeals for a ceasefire from two of his closest allies, the US and the UK? We like to think that we have influence on partners in the Middle East, but it appears very little these days.
Well, domestically, I think Mr. Netanyahu has powerful reasons why he wants to press on. First of all, he liked to present himself as a key prime minister for Israel's security. And Israel was in effect caught napping on the 7th of October when those frightful atrocities were committed by Hamas, when they came over the border. And the image of Mr. Netanyahu was obviously very badly tarnished by that. He has spent the last year trying to re-establish his credentials as a strong security prime minister, and he has committed himself to defeating both Hamas and Hezbollah and what he sees as those the major security threats to Israel. So there's a reputational and legacy issue for him. There's also a political issue, which is he knows that if he does press ahead with the ceasefire that so many people are urging on him, his government is like to fall apart. And so there are pressing domestic political reasons for him to keep going. I think in the last few weeks, perhaps more now, he's also thought that the tide has turned militarily and that he is getting on top of both Hamas and Hezbollah. And he now wants to press on to what he sees as a possible victory over both of these organizations. And possibly changing the whole dynamic, political and military dynamic in the region.
Yeah.
I think there is great skepticism in Western capitals that this is actually possible, that these organizations can be defeated, and that even if they are in the short term, that there won't be long-term consequences which will be very difficult to deal with. But I think those are the immediate preoccupations that Mr. Netanyahu has.